Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Some Sadducees, those who said there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married the widow, and so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman herself also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife shall she be? For all 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for in him all are alive. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any more questions. A gospel inspired by God. I want you for a few moments to imagine a speedometer or a clock which has 5 positions on the dial. And it's the clock or the speedometer of thinking. And for me, there are 5 positions on this. The first one is innocence. The kind of people whom you can tell them anything and they will unquestioningly believe it. Totally hook, line, and sinker. It's the first position. The second position would be naivete. The naive person is not totally innocent. They'll raise some feeble objections to your position, but you can very, very easily persuade them to the contrary. Then the third position is critical thinking, where you look at the data on the basis of its own merits and you decide for or against the position, based on all of the data available to you. The fourth position is the skeptic, and the skeptic is basically opposed to any idea which is not his own or which he doesn't previously, subscribe to. But if you give the skeptic enough evidence to the contrary, he'll change his mind. And then the fifth position is the debunker. And the debunker is totally closed. No matter how much evidence you adduce, the debunker will stick rigidly to his previous position. There was a famous debunker, a very famous a physicist at one stage from the latter category, who said, this is the kind of thing that even if it were true, I wouldn't believe it. He was talking about psychic abilities, for instance. And so these are the 5 great positions. Now, the debunkers are totally closed people. They're fundamentalists. Whether you're talking about religious ideas or scientific ideas, they're fundamentalists. And a favorite ploy of this debunker, this type of person, is a philosophical fallacy called reductio ad absurdum, where you take your opponent's position and you create a caricature of it, reduce it to a ridiculous version of it, and then you demolish the ridiculous version of it. And you think by demolishing the ridiculous version of it, you've destroyed the entire argument. Now, this is precisely what's happening in this morning's gospel story. So I need to give you a little bit of the background to it. As it says, the Sadducees were those who did not believe in resurrection, or spirits, or angels. So here's the background to it. 721 BC, 10 northern tribes of the land of Israel are taken off by the Assyrian Empire, and they're never heard of again. The southern kingdom of Judah survived for about 120 years, and then in the year 598 BC, the Babylonians, who had in the interim overthrown the Assyrian Empire, come in and they invade Judea, and they take off the last 2 tribes of Israel, and they demolish the city and the first temple. And the Judeans are in exile in the land of Babylon for almost 70 years. And then the Persians overthrow the Babylonians in the year 529 BC, and they set a remnant of Israel free to come back into the land of Israel. But during the 70 years that they lived in Babylon, they came under the influence of a great Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was the first concerted effort to reduce the pantheon of the gods down just to two divinities, a god of light and a god of dark. The god of light was called Ahura Mazda, and the god of darkness was called Ahriman. But also the Persians, the Zoroastrians, had a belief in life after death, which Judaism hadn't had at that stage. They believed in angels and they believed in spirits. So when they come back from the land of Israel, from the land of Babylon, under the influence of Zoroastrianism, they complete their own Bible. There had been two sections of the Bible before that. There had been the Torah, which were the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and there had been the prophets, all the great prophets. Now there'll be a third part of the Bible, which is called the writings. And it had to do with the existential musings that they came under the influence of Zoroastrianism. So they're thinking about all these kinds of existential issues, including life after death, and the existence of spirits, and the existence of angels. And when they come back, there are two great groupings. There's the Sadducees and there are the Pharisees. Now the Sadducees are the priests, and they're the clerical theologians, whereas the Pharisees are the lay theologians. So they've got very, very different mindsets. And the Pharisees completely adopted the notion of life after death, the existence of angels, and the existence of spirits. The Sadducees refused to accept any of that. So the Sadducees only accepted Torah and the prophets. They did not accept the third part of the Bible. And so it's, I believe actually that even the word Pharisee itself had to do with the language of, the Farsi language of Persia. And so that the Pharisee party represented those thinkers who had been greatly influenced by Farsi or by the Zoroastrian thinking. And so they're cognate as far as I'm concerned. So fast forward now to the time of Jesus. This is nearly 600 years later. And the controversy continues. The Sadducees still do not believe in life after death or resurrection. They do not believe in spirits or they do not believe in angels. The Pharisees believe in all these. And so in today's story, a group of Sadducees comes to Jesus and they're going to take this argument about resurrection and they're going to create a ridiculous situation and offer it to Jesus to demolish his teaching on resurrection. And what they do is they take a law called the Levirate Law, which comes from the book of Moses. And the Levirate Law says, as you heard, if a man is married and he dies childless, one of his brothers has to marry the widow to raise up children to the dead man. And now legally, whatever children, the first child that issued from that second union was technically and legally the child of the deceased man. And so it was the only way that a person could be remembered, because since they didn't at that stage believe in life after death, the only way you could survive death was through being remembered by future generations. So if you had kids and grandkids, or maybe even great-grandkids, there's a possibility that your memory could survive for maybe 3 more generations, and that was the only kind of resurrection that was possible, or the only kind of life after death that was possible. And so this was the intent of the Levirate Law, that people would be remembered for at least 2 or 3 generations through their children or through their grandchildren. So they proposed this scenario to Jesus. Here's this guy, he's married to a woman, he dies and he has no children. So his brother marries the woman and he dies without any children. And there's 7 brothers and they all marry this woman and they all die without having children. And then finally the woman herself dies. And then they go, no, smarty pants, explain that one to us. Whose wife is she going to be? Because she was married to all 7. And I think they've totally demolished, the argument of resurrection. And of course, Jesus takes it to a whole other level. He takes it from the realm of the legalisms and the physical to the level of the love, to the level of love, and the level of metaphysics. And he's talking about, you don't understand the difference between our physical existence and our eternal existence. In heaven, he says, there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage, because we're spirits or we're like angels. So in one fell swoop, he's taking issue with their problems with resurrection, the existence of angels, and the existence of spirits. And he's pointing out that it's a totally different reality. It is not physical, and it's not about legalisms. It's not about a Levirate Law. It's about love, and it's about metaphysics, that we're eternal beings. And that in some sense, incarnation is just a phase, or a mission that we're on. And then he goes back to the books that they do accept, the books of Moses, and he demolishes their own argument from Moses himself. He says, don't you remember the passage in Scripture where Moses is having an encounter with God at the burning bush? And when he asks God to identify himself, he identifies himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, Moses flourished about 1250 BC. Abraham had died in 1850 BC, so Abraham is dead 600 years at this stage. So Jesus says to them, do you think God is the God of cadavers and corpses, or is he the God of the living? Why would God identify himself as the God of Abram, who'd been dead 600 years, unless Abram continues to be and to exist? So he demolishes them on the basis of the parts of the Bible they accept and the parts of the Bible that they don't accept. So what he's leading to is the notion that you find in many different traditions, articulated best of all, in my opinion, in the Hindu philosophy, that there are many, many different levels to body. Within the Greek language itself, in which the New Testament has been written, there are 3 words for body. There's sarx, which is this physical, flesh and blood stuff. And then there's soma, which is the energy body. And then there's pneuma, which is the spirit body. And when you read the New Testament, in order to understand Christ's teaching on resurrection and Christ's teaching on Eucharist, you have to distinguish between these 3 forms of body. So Christ is not talking about the resurrection of a physical carcass, because the truth is this physical carcass is merely a spacesuit, all of whose parts have been borrowed from other people. There's actually a limited number of molecules of matter on the planet. It's a huge number, but it is limited. So we just keep sharing them with each other. And on the hour that we will all spend together here this morning, we will literally share millions of molecules of matter with each other. So we're constantly born. So if the resurrection of the dead consists of physical, carcasses resurrecting from the dead and trying to figure out, where did I leave my big toe? Where's my kidney? And the truth is, Joe's going to say to me, I had that kidney first before you had it, so I want it back. To whom does it belong? It's like a group of teenage girls who are constantly changing clothes with each other, until finally you don't know whose blouse was this originally, or whose stockings were there originally. They keep shifting and combining in various permutations until you don't know finally, to whom did this particular article of clothing ultimately belong. So every single cell in your body belonged to somebody else at some stage. So who's going to have priority if resurrection is about the physical resurrection? And of course it's not. It's ludicrous. These are just spacesuits that we need for our mission, and that's what Christ is saying. And so the body that's sown in the earth and the body that rises is totally different. Paul uses a beautiful metaphor for this. He says, when you plant a flower or a bulb in the earth, and you look at what comes out of it, if you didn't know something about horticulture, you would never have guessed that this beautiful daffodil came from this little ugly little kind of bud. So what goes into the ground, what comes out are radically different. What goes in after death, the carcass that's put in the ground, is totally different from the spirit that emerges from that. So we live at so many different levels, and resurrection has to do with the release of the soul that had volunteered for incarnation. And the body is reduced to what the body belonged. We borrowed our body from 2 sources. We borrowed carbon, from the sunlight, and we borrowed nitrogen from the earth, and now it goes back to the earth and it goes back to sunlight if we're cremated or buried, whatever. So we just return to Mother Earth, the duds that we borrowed for her in order to have an experience of incarnation. But the spirit, which is eternal, goes back to source. Okay, guys. Connie. Okay, good. Go first.
Okay. Of thought. Yeah. I think that the mature person is capable of paradox,
Yes.
and the ability to hold 2 opposites in mind at the same time. And I think this is one of the characteristics that really separates someone who has mature thought from someone who is naive or just debunker.
Right.
And so, and probably the most difficult is to think of this physical and the spiritual as coexisting. I read a very interesting long article last night, and it really talked about, it was based on quantum physics, which always fascinates me in terms of how it relates really to spirituality. function of electrons. And we never really know where they are unless
Right.
they change and become a particle.
Mm-hmm.
But in these quantum physics terms, everything is composed of electrons
Yes.
and wave functions, and we are all sharing that same electron. I mean, it's within each and every one of us all the time, so
Brilliant.
we are really all
Connected.
And this is what is surviving
Okay.
the physical death.
Yes.
Because it's timeless, it's energy.
Yes.
And energy is not done.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant living. It's one of the basic laws of physics, the law of the conservation of energy, can't be destroyed or created. There was a very famous Irish physicist who created what is probably the second most important formula of the 20th century, a guy called John Bell, and it's called Bell's theorem, and it literally shows that every single particle in the universe is connected to every other particle in the universe, that the whole thing operates together. And then a very famous French physicist called Alain Spectre demonstrated that subsequently in a laboratory, that if you were to take two, subatomic particles that are somehow connected in some fashion and send them to opposite ends of the universe, and you change one facet of one of them, the other immediately changes, at much faster than the speed of light. So they're all interconnected. It's demonstrated theoretically and experimentally. Irrespective of distance.
No, action at a distance.
Action at a distance, yeah. Which Einstein had a problem with. He called it spooky action at a distance. Yeah, but the truth is, it's all interconnected. It's all, and it is the observing consciousness that reduces the wave down to a particular outcome or a kind of a particle. So I remember listening to a great lecture by a cosmologist called Brian Swaim years and years and years ago. And if I'm listening to a lecture, as I'm driving up and down to Healdsburg, I'll stop the podcast as soon as I hear something that really kind of fascinates me and think about it. And he made this statement. He said, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. I'm thinking, what? So I turn off the podcast. I'm thinking, is he telling me that 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue and daffodils weren't yellow and grass wasn't green? I put it back on again. He says, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. Because 1 billion years ago, the eye did not exist. The eye was created by a little creature called a trilobite 545 million years ago. So a billion years ago, there was no consciousness on the planet that could infer color from nature. So in the absence of an appropriate witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal aspects of itself. It is the presence of an appropriate consciousness that infers a particular aspect or facet from nature. And so a witnessing consciousness would be a culture. So particular cultures can only infer particular data from nature. Different cultures infer different data. And then you get the paradox of two different sets of inferences and how they're at odds with each other. Or you get a spiritual perspective will infer a whole bunch of information from reality that a scientific mindset cannot infer. And they appear to be contradictory, but they're not contradictory. They're just two facets being revealed by two different kinds of witnessing consciousnesses. I remember as a young boy, in the year between my junior year and senior year in high school, I spent the entire summer holidays in parts of Ireland where Gaelic is still the mother tongue. Areas that are called in Irish the Gaeltacht, and the Gaeltacht is where Irish is still the kind of native language. And I was collecting proverbs from the old people, and I would ask them, tell me a proverb, and then explain to me the context in which you would use it. And visited with many elderly people during that period of time. And I collected 432 proverbs that I put into a little booklet. But I remember one old man saying to me at one stage, he was saying, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. Because the Proverbs are the distillation of the wisdom of a culture. But one of the things I discovered with Proverbs is that Proverbs always contradict each other. Because nature is so paradoxical that there are instances where you can say A is true and instances in which A is not true. And so I give simple examples, like in English we have look before you leap, but he who hesitates is lost. In Irish we have ones that say Níl tin tán mar de hin tán féin. There is no fireside like your own fireside. But then we also say Bíon blas ar chud an chorsan. There's a special taste to the neighbour's food. If you're a small child, the food in the neighbour's house always tastes better than the food in your own house. And in Swahili we have two great proverbs, one of which says, haraka, haraka, heina baraka, which means hurry, hurry has no blessing. But we also say, chilewa, chilewa, mtoto siwako. Delay, delay, and the baby will not be yours. If you marry somebody in Africa and you don't consummate the marriage, she's not going to hang around. She really wants to be a mother. So she's going to become a mother, and the child won't be yours. So truth is so multifaceted that it is paradoxical in its very, very nature. And the ability, as you point out, Connie, beautifully, is that the ability to hold the paradox is a sign of wisdom and openness. And the inability to hold the paradox is a sign of a fundamentalist kind of thinker from one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum. Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah. Bobby?
I'm totally overwhelmed. I'm paradoxically held.
Ooh, I love it. Are you paradoxically challenged?
Yes.
Good. Karen.
This holding of the paradox is what's at the heart of any kind of art.
Yes, that's brilliant.
You know, your poetry, your music,
Yes.
your arts, it's all.
Yes.
It's because that's what.
Right.
It's that. Because it's like creating itself as it goes.
Totally.
Because the things are constantly
Right.
interacting and changing.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. It says that the paradox is at the core of all kind of art form. Because it's, in some senses, for me it represents the feminine principle, you know, that in the Celtic tradition, the night comes before the day, or the winter comes before the summer. And so the idea in the Celtic dispensation is that darkness is the fecund womb out of which all light and life emerges. So you have to have the mysterious darkness, the feminine principle, before the light of consciousness or the male principle can emerge. And so the day begins in the Celtic calendar at what we would regard as 6 p.m. in the evening. You have to have the darkness in order to generate the light. The same thing is true of the Celtic year. The Celtic year begins with Samhain, which is the 1st of November, when the dark period of the year is what gives birth to the light. In the West, we have the opposite notion. It's opposite. The darkness is the bad stuff that eats up the light. And so the light is there first, and then the darkness gobbles it up at 6 p.m. in the evening, you know, or the 1st of November. So it's a totally different notion. So the paradox is the ability to hold something in the mystery of the darkness of the feminine principle of the womb. Yeah.
And nothing exists without its opposite.
Exactly. Nothing exists without its opposite. Yeah. Yeah. We live in a world. Dualism has a purpose, and dualism is the ability to allow us to appreciate, you know, all aspects. And when there's only unity consciousness, in some senses, there's no ability to generate experience, which is why I think that the transcendence of God had to result in an immanence. You know, there had to be a kind of an experiential aspect. And in order to experience, there needs to be some form of duality or even multiplicity. In the presence of a unity consciousness, in some senses, no experience is possible, except being. Connie, sorry, Georgia.
It's interesting that, you know, we're in an age of colleges, universities, and higher education. How several hundreds of years ago and further back, for instance, the American Indian had beautiful sayings about proverbs about watching nature, and, you know, if you touch a spider's web in one place, it vibrates through the entire web, and yet there's something in each one of us that the ego says, oh no, what I'm doing is separate from the rest. But we do send out these waves that if we could just be more awake and conscious of that, perhaps we'd be a little more mindful about our actions.
So there's the paradox again for us, that in some senses we're all operating from the same core, same source, but we all articulate it in very different ways. And so the way I illustrate this sometimes is, you take the English language, it only has 26 characters. We call it the alphabet. But all of the works of Shakespeare are literally just permutations, combinations of 26 symbols. You take, for instance, music, you know, 7 notes. All of Mozart is just combinations and permutations of these. You take your nucleotides. You know, the DNA is composed of just 4 nucleotides. But all life form on planet Earth are just permutations and combinations of these 4. Or my favorite example, you take binary mathematics, you know, a Boolean algebra, which is the basis of all computer language. So it needs 2 symbols, 0 and 1. You know, and on the basis of combining these zeros and ones in different sequences, you create everything you see and hear on your television screen or your computer. And so, in some senses, you know, what we're operating with is very, very simple. It's unity consciousness. But the ways in which we combine the symbols of unity consciousness create the pluriformity of our experiences. And each one of us is just like we're a particular work of Shakespeare. So the fact that Shakespeare wrote sonnets and Hamlet and Macbeth or whatever, you know, you can't just focus on one of them and say, this represents, you know, Shakespeare's endeavor. Yeah, so every single one represents some way in which we combine the alphabet soup of reality or the binary mathematics of reality, but we do it in a very unique fashion. So we have to, you know, honor the perspective of the other. And by combining all these, we begin to kind of back ourselves into the source.
Shakespeare said, nothing's ever right or wrong, but thinking makes it.
Exactly. There's nothing either right nor wrong, but thinking makes it so. Or Rumi would have said, out beyond right doing and beyond wrong doing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. Yeah.
And there's one from Ramana Maharshi.
Okay.
I just read yesterday.
Okay.
It was, the question was, how do we treat the other? And his answer, there is no other.
Oh, I love it. How do we treat the other? There is no other. That's beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah.
Now that's a paradox.
Totally. Yeah.
That's a hard one to
Totally.
grasp.
Yeah. Great case. Let's stand and pray. God, our Father and our Mother, we thank you again this morning for the miracle of a brand new day in which we can attempt to be channels of love, of light and of logos, of life and of laughter, of wisdom and information for our planet and for our times. For this we pray to the Lord.
Loving God.